The thick jungle canopy near Taivu Point pressed down like a living ceiling. Palm fronds dripped with moisture. Vines strangled every tree trunk. The air hung motionless and suffocating. Through this green hell, Second Lieutenant Genjiro Imei of the 8th Independent Anti-Tank Gun Company crept forward with 916 other soldiers. Colonel Kiyonawi Ichiki's detachment had just completed their nighttime landing from destroyers. The date was August 19, 1942. Imei clutched his diary against his chest. His observations would capture something unprecedented. The shock that was about to shatter every assumption these battle-hardened veterans held. They moved in single file through undergrowth so dense that visibility dropped to arm's length. Every step squelched in mud. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds. The smell of rotting vegetation filled their nostrils. Japanese command had briefed them with supreme confidence. The Americans numbered perhaps 2,000 men. Poorly trained troops, easily frightened soldiers, soft men from lives of luxury. Colonel Ichiki himself had dismissed all warnings to wait for reinforcements. His words echoed in every soldier's mind. "These are Americans. We will sweep them into the sea before sunrise." None of these warriors from China and Southeast Asia could imagine what awaited them. They had known nothing but victory since 1937. Defeat was not merely unthinkable, it was impossible. Their tactical assumptions had never failed. Their strategic concepts had never been challenged. Their ideological certainties had never wavered. The jungle itself was about to betray them. This darkness that Japanese forces had owned since the war began would turn against them. American superiority in equipment would emerge like a hidden beast. Coordination beyond their comprehension would unfold. Destructive capability they had never encountered would rain down. The myth of Japanese invincibility in close combat was about to shatter like glass. The transformation had begun exactly 2 weeks earlier. August 7th brought 11,000 United States Marines of the 1st Marine Division crashing ashore at Red Beach. General Alexander Vandegrift's Leathernecks were executing something called Operation Watchtower. The first American offensive operation of the Pacific War was underway. Their mission looked simple on paper. Seize the nearly completed Japanese airfield. Establish a defensive perimeter around it. Hold the position until relief arrived. Reality would prove far different. They were walking into the longest and most brutal campaign in Marine Corps history up to that moment. An environment that would test human endurance beyond all previous limits. Guadalcanal stretched like a green nightmare across the Solomon Sea. 90 miles long, 25 miles wide. Its interior mountains reached 8,000 feet into clouds that never lifted. The coastal plain where Henderson Field sat was a strip of hell. Kunai grass grew higher than a man's head. Swamps stretched for miles. Jungle growth was so thick that men disappeared 3 feet from their companions. Heat pressed down like a physical weight. Humidity never dropped below 90%. Breathing felt like drowning in warm soup. Mosquitoes formed clouds so dense that soldiers inhaled them with every breath. Rivers and streams looked clear and inviting in reconnaissance photographs. They teemed with parasites, invisible to the naked eye. Malaria waited in every shadow. Dengue fever lurked in stagnant water. Dysentery would disable more men than bullets. Tropical ulcers would eat through flesh down to bone. Disease would become a more deadly enemy than any human force. But on that first morning of the invasion, Marines found Henderson Field almost empty. The 2,200 Japanese construction workers had vanished. The 600 naval troops had melted into green shadows. Equipment sat abandoned. Supplies lay scattered. Most critically, The airfield itself was undefended. Marines walked across the runway in amazement. Not a shot had been fired. By nightfall on August 8th, American engineers were already working. They would complete what the Japanese had started. The runway would bear a new name, Henderson Field, after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at Midway. Within days, the first American aircraft would touch down on Japanese concrete. The Cactus Air Force was about to be born. This ramshackle collection of Marine, Navy, and Army pilots would write their names in aviation history. Japanese response came swift and devastating. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa led 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer through darkness on August 9th. His surprise attack was brilliant in its execution. Catastrophic for American naval forces. The Battle of Savo Island became the worst defeat in United States Navy history. 4 heavy cruisers went to the bottom in less than an hour. USS Quincy disappeared beneath black waters. USS Vincennes followed her down. USS Astoria broke apart in flames. HMAS Canberra joined them in the depths. More than 1,000 sailors died in waters that burned with fuel oil. Bodies floated among debris. Screams echoed across the Sound. Survivors clung to wreckage in shark-infested seas. The remaining Allied naval forces withdrew in panic. Most supplies had not yet been unloaded. Marines watched their lifeline disappear over the horizon. They were stranded, cut off from support, facing a reinforced enemy with barely half their equipment and food. Japanese high command failed to grasp what Henderson Field truly meant. Control of the airfield meant control of surrounding seas during daylight. Aircraft operating from Henderson could strike any Japanese ship within 200 miles. This single fact would dictate everything that followed. Japanese forces could own the darkness. Fast destroyers could run troops and supplies in night operations. These became known as the Tokyo Express. But when dawn broke, American aircraft ruled the skies. Every Japanese ship caught in daylight faced destruction from above. The strategic situation demanded immediate action. Japan had to retake Henderson Field before Americans could fortify their position. Imperial General Headquarters assigned the task to Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake's 17th Army. They were based at Rabaul, hundreds of miles away. Hyakutake had limited forces scattered across the Pacific. The 35th Infantry Brigade under Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi was at Palau. The 4th Infantry Regiment was tied down in the Philippines. The closest available unit was Colonel Ichiki's 28th Infantry Regiment. They had been stationed near Guam after the cancelled Midway operation. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki was an infantry school instructor. His reputation as a first-rate tactician was matched only by his supreme confidence in Japanese fighting spirit over American materiel. He was also known for being impulsive, dangerously so. Clear orders reached Ichiki before departing truck for Guadalcanal. Wait for the rest of your regiment. Do not attempt to retake the airfield alone. These orders would be ignored. Ichiki had studied every report from China, every account from the Philippines, every encounter between Japanese forces and Western troops. The pattern was always the same. Americans lacked discipline. They broke under pressure. They could not match Japanese warriors in close combat. 6 destroyers delivered 917 men of Ichiki's first element to Taivu Point on August 18th. The landing went perfectly. No American forces detected their arrival. They were 15 miles east of the marine perimeter, close enough to strike, far enough to prepare. Ichiki immediately dispatched reconnaissance patrols, a routine tactical decision, standard procedure for any competent commander. It would prove fatal. On August 19th, Company A, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines moved along the coastal track toward Coley Point. Captain Charles Brush led the patrol through oppressive heat. Sweat soaked their uniforms. Salt stung their eyes. The sound of surf masked all other noise. Then they spotted movement ahead. Japanese soldiers moving through coconut palms. The two forces collided in sudden, vicious combat. Rifles cracked. Grenades exploded. Men screamed and died in the space of minutes. When the smoke cleared, 31 Japanese soldiers lay dead. Marines had captured documents that changed everything. The papers revealed the presence of a significant enemy force in the area. More importantly, they showed Japanese intelligence had severely underestimated American strength. Captain Brush raced back to the perimeter with his intelligence haul. General Vandegrift immediately grasped the implications. A Japanese attack was coming. Soon, probably from the east along the most obvious approach route. He ordered Colonel Clifton Cates to strengthen defenses along the sandbar at the mouth of what Marines called the Tenaroo River, actually the Ilu River, but the misidentification stuck in all subsequent accounts. Geography mattered less than preparation. Cates deployed Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Cresswell's 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, along the riverbank. Machine guns went into position to create interlocking fields of fire across the sandbar. Every angle was calculated. Every approach route was covered. No space remained undefended. The sandbar stretched perhaps 50 yards across. Open ground with no cover. Deep water on both sides channeled any attack into a killing zone. It was perfect terrain for defense. Suicide ground for attackers. What happened next became legend in Marine Corps history. One of the most one-sided battles ever fought by American forces. Colonel Ichiki chose not to wait for intelligence from his lost patrol. He would not wait for reinforcements. He decided to attack immediately. Night assault on August 20th into early morning August 21st. Frontal attack directly across the sandbar. Japanese doctrine emphasized spiritual power over material advantage. Aggressive night attacks could overcome enemy firepower through sheer audacity. Ichiki believed his veterans could break American defenses in close combat. Bayonets and grenades would triumph where bullets failed. Just after midnight, Solomon Islander scout Jacob Vuza stumbled into Marine lines. The Japanese had captured him hours earlier, tortured him brutally, bayoneted him repeatedly, left him for dead. He had crawled miles to bring a warning. The Japanese were coming. In strength. Tonight. Minutes later, the attack began with otherworldly fury. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers charged across the sandbar. Battle cries split the night air. Rifles flashed in darkness. Grenades exploded like firecrackers. They ran straight into methodical destruction. The M19-17A1 Browning water-cooled machine guns opened fire. These weapons had been perfected during World War I. They were the unsung heroes of Marine firepower. Each gun could sustain 600 rounds per minute indefinitely, as long as water stayed in the cooling jacket. Marines had positioned them in mutually supporting locations. No area of the sandbar remained uncovered by overlapping fire. Japanese soldiers fell in waves as heavy .30 caliber rounds tore through flesh and shattered bone. Those who made it across encountered 37mm anti-tank guns loaded with canister rounds, giant shotgun shells that turned human bodies into shredded meat. The attack continued for hours without pause. Wave after wave of Japanese soldiers charged into machine gun fire. Some reached Marine positions and fought hand-to-hand. Marines used rifles, knives, entrenching tools, bare fists, anything that could kill. But defensive preparations held firm. Interlocking fields of fire prevented any breakthrough. As dawn approached, Colonel Ichiki's attack had completely stalled. More than 800 of his men lay dead or dying on sand soaked with blood. Daybreak brought no relief for surviving Japanese. General Vandegrift ordered a counterattack using elements of 1st Battalion, 1st Marines. 5 M3 Stuart light tanks crossed the sandbar and began systematically hunting down Japanese soldiers who had taken cover in coconut groves. War correspondent Richard Tregaskis watched from a Marine position. His description captured the methodical slaughter. It was fascinating to see them bustling amongst the trees, pivoting and turning, spitting sheets of yellow flame. We had not realized there were so many Japanese in the grove. Group after group were flushed out and shot down by the tank's canister shells. By midday, August 21st, the Battle of the Tenaru was over. Of 917 Japanese soldiers who had landed at Taivu Point, approximately 800 were dead. About 128 survivors, mostly from support units that remained near the landing site, melted into jungle shadows. They would send a radio message to 17th Army headquarters reporting the disaster. Among the dead was Colonel Ichiki himself. Accounts differ on how he died. The official Japanese version claimed he burned his regimental colors and committed ritual suicide. Some witnesses insisted he died leading a final charge against Marine positions. Marine casualties were approximately 40 killed and wounded total. The disparity was staggering, unbelievable, but undeniable. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese soldiers was devastating beyond measure. Captured documents and post-war accounts revealed the same shocking realization repeated again and again. An entire regiment had been annihilated in a single night. Veterans of China and Southeast Asia had been slaughtered like cattle. Americans had not fought the way Japanese doctrine predicted. They did not panic under night attack. They did not break when charged by screaming warriors. They did not flee when faced with superior fighting spirit. Instead, they had waited in prepared positions, allowed Japanese forces to enter killing zones, then systematically destroyed them with concentrated firepower that never seemed to end. The most devastating revelation came from examining captured equipment and battlefield conditions. Americans possessed material wealth that Japanese intelligence had completely failed to comprehend. Browning machine guns never jammed, never overheated beyond their designed capacity, never failed from poor maintenance or inadequate spare parts. Every Marine seemed to carry more ammunition than an entire Japanese squad. Artillery support that Marines could call upon exceeded anything Japanese forces could deploy. Coordination between infantry, artillery, and naval gunfire from ships offshore represented an integrated system of destruction unlike anything Japanese forces had ever encountered. Within days of the Tenaru disaster, more Japanese forces were already en route to Guadalcanal. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto organized a massive naval operation to support the next attempt to retake Henderson Field. 3 slow transport ships departed Truk on August 16th. They carried the remaining 1,400 soldiers from Ichiki's regiment plus 500 naval marines. After the naval battle of the Eastern Solomons resulted in heavy damage to one transport, Japanese command abandoned slow transport ships entirely. They would use destroyers exclusively for what became known as Tokyo Express runs. Between August 29th and September 4th, various destroyers and light cruisers delivered almost 5,000 troops of Major General Kawaguchi's 35th Infantry Brigade to Taivu Point, the same landing site where Ichiki's regiment had met destruction. The Tokyo Express worked brilliantly as a method of moving men. Destroyers could make the round trip from the Shortland Islands to Guadalcanal in a single night. This minimized exposure to American air attack. But the method contained a critical weakness. Heavy equipment could not be transported this way. Artillery pieces were too bulky. Tanks were impossible. Trucks would not fit. Most importantly, adequate food and ammunition had to be left behind. This logistical reality would ultimately doom every Japanese offensive on Guadalcanal. Soldiers arrived with only what they could carry on their backs. They depended on local foraging and whatever supplies could be infiltrated through American lines. As the campaign wore on, Japanese troops would fight not just American firepower, but starvation itself. General Kawaguchi set September 12th as the date for his assault on Henderson Field. His plan called for a three-pronged attack designed to overwhelm American defenses through simultaneous pressure from multiple directions. One force would strike from the west along the coastal area. A second force would attack from the south, penetrating through dense jungle to strike what Japanese intelligence believed was the weakest point in American defenses. Kawaguchi himself would lead the main effort from the south, approaching along an inland ridge that dominated Henderson Field. What Kawaguchi did not know was that Marine intelligence had already identified this ridge as the most likely avenue of Japanese approach. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson, commanding officer of the 1st Raider Battalion, conducted a raid on Tasimboko village on September 8th. The raiders discovered massive supply dumps hidden in the jungle, thousands of rounds of ammunition, medical supplies, food stores, radio equipment. The quantities indicated a large Japanese force was concentrating in the area for major operations. Edson immediately understood the Japanese plan. They would come from the south using the ridge as their primary approach route. The terrain channeled attackers toward Henderson Field. It was the obvious choice for any competent commander. Edson requested permission to establish a defensive line on the ridge itself. General Vandegrift approved immediately. On September 10th and 11th, Edson positioned approximately 840 Marines from his Raiders and 1st Parachute Battalion along the ridge. He selected defensive positions with the same methodical care that had characterized the Tenaru defenses. Machine guns positioned to create interlocking fire across likely approach routes. Mortar crews registered on terrain features where Japanese forces might concentrate. Artillery from the 11th Marines plotted defensive fire missions covering every possible avenue of attack. Every advantage of terrain and firepower was calculated and prepared with mathematical precision. The ridge itself was a narrow coral spine, approximately 1,000 meters long. It consisted of 3 distinct hills covered with kunai grass and scattered trees. Deep ravines bordered both sides, heavily wooded and in some places completely impenetrable. It was perfect terrain for a night attack by infiltrating infantry. Small units could work through the ravines, approach from unexpected angles, strike at weak points in defensive lines. It was also, if properly defended, a perfectly designed killing ground. On the night of September 12th, Kawaguchi's forces began their assault with far greater sophistication than Ichiki's frontal charge. Japanese infantry infiltrated through ravines on both sides of the ridge. They attempted to envelop American positions from multiple directions simultaneously. Small units probed for weak points in Marine defenses. When they found gaps, larger forces concentrated for breakthrough attempts. The fighting was savage and confused in tropical darkness. Marines sometimes found themselves engaged in hand-to-hand combat with Japanese soldiers who had infiltrated to within grenade range of their positions. Muzzle flashes lit the jungle like lightning. Screams echoed through the night. The smell of gunpowder mixed with blood and fear. But defensive preparations held against every assault. When Japanese forces concentrated for breakthrough attempts, Marine mortars and artillery from the 11th Marines shattered them with precision fire. More than 2,000 rounds fell during the night, dropping high-explosive shells so close to Marine positions that shrapnel wounded friendly troops. Machine gun crews fired until their barrels glowed red in the darkness like coals. Individual Marines fought with rifles, pistols, knives, entrenching tools, anything that came to hand. Every man became a rifleman. Every position became a fortress. Sergeant Major Jacob Vuza, the same scout who had warned of the Tenarue attack, moved through the lines encouraging Marines and pointing out Japanese infiltration routes. His presence was worth a company of reinforcements. Sergeant John Basilone manned a machine gun position that became critical to the defense. When his gun crews were killed or wounded, Basilone continued firing alone. He repelled wave after wave of Japanese attacks through the long night. His actions would later earn him the Medal of Honor. As dawn broke on September 13th, the Japanese attack had failed to achieve breakthrough. But Kawaguchi had more troops available and prepared to renew the assault the following night. The battle was far from over. Edson pulled his lines back to the center of the ridge, consolidating his forces into stronger positions. General Vandegrift sent reinforcements, bringing the total defending force to approximately 2,500 men. More machine guns, more mortars, more concentrated firepower. The Japanese would attack again. But this time Marines were ready with even stronger positions and more devastating defensive preparations. The second night's fighting was even more intense than the first. Kawaguchi threw his remaining forces into desperate attempts to break through before American reinforcements made the position impregnable forever. Japanese soldiers charged repeatedly through machine gun fire that never ceased. They died by the hundreds on slopes already soaked with blood from the previous night. Some attacks came within 50 yards of Edson's command post before being stopped by point-blank fire. At one point, the situation became so desperate that Edson himself grabbed a rifle and joined the firing line. Officers and enlisted men fought side by side. Rank meant nothing. Only killing power mattered. But again, American firepower and defensive preparation prevailed against Japanese courage and determination. By dawn on September 14th, Kawaguchi's offensive had completely collapsed into bloody failure. Japanese casualties were staggering beyond belief. Approximately 830 to 850 Japanese soldiers died on and around what would forever after be known as Edson's Ridge or Bloody Ridge. Marine casualties totaled approximately 104 killed and over 200 wounded between the Raider and Parachute battalions. The ridge had become a monument to the effectiveness of American defensive doctrine, proof that proper preparation could overcome any assault, no matter how determined or skillfully executed. For Japanese soldiers who survived these two catastrophic defeats, the battles represented another profound shock to their understanding of modern warfare. Captured diaries and post-war accounts consistently described the same devastating realization. Japanese forces had expected to fight other infantry in darkness, where their training and fighting spirit would triumph over American softness. Instead, they encountered artillery that fell with pinpoint accuracy, machine guns that never jammed or overheated, mortars that found them wherever they tried to hide. American commanders knew the Japanese were coming. They prepared killing zones with mathematical precision. They waited for Japanese forces to enter these zones. Then they destroyed them with coordinated fire support that seemed unlimited in its destructive power. The battles at Tenarue and Bloody Ridge established patterns that would repeat throughout the entire Guadalcanal campaign like a deadly symphony. Japanese forces would launch attacks based on courage, night tactics, and close combat expertise that had never failed before. American forces would respond with overwhelming firepower, coordinated combined arms operations, and defensive positions carefully prepared to maximize every possible advantage. The outcome became predictable with mathematical certainty. Japanese casualties would be catastrophic, unsustainable, devastating to morale and combat effectiveness. American casualties would be significant, but sustainable, replaceable, within acceptable limits for strategic objectives. But raw numbers alone could not capture the horror of jungle warfare on Guadalcanal. The environment itself became a weapon that killed with complete impartiality, caring nothing for nationality or fighting spirit. Malaria infected nearly every man who spent more than a few weeks on the island. Mosquitoes carried the parasite in clouds so dense they blocked out moonlight. By December 1942, the 1st Marine Division would report over 8,000 malaria cases among approximately 12,000 men. Tropical diseases disabled approximately 2/3 of the division at any given time. Dengue fever struck without warning. Dysentery was universal, weakening men until they could barely stand. Fungal infections ate through skin in the constant humidity. Jungle rot caused open sores that never healed in the humid heat. Dental problems with no proper treatment led to abscessed teeth and systemic infections that killed as surely as bullets. Men's gums swelled until they could not eat. Teeth fell out from malnutrition and disease. Medical supplies were inadequate for the scale of suffering. The Japanese suffered conditions far worse than anything Americans endured. Their supply situation meant inadequate food from the very beginning of operations. Soldiers were supposed to receive field rations calculated to maintain strength and health. But the Tokyo Express could rarely deliver enough supplies to feed the growing number of troops on Guadalcanal. Men subsisted on whatever they could forage from the hostile jungle environment: roots and bark, insects and small animals, anything that might provide calories to keep them alive another day. Occasional rice deliveries had to be stretched impossibly thin among thousands of starving soldiers. Starvation became a constant companion more feared than American bullets. Men grew skeletal. Their uniforms hung loose on wasted frames. Muscle disappeared. Bones showed through skin. The ability to fight, to think clearly, to function as soldiers, deteriorated with each passing day. Medical supplies were almost non-existent for Japanese forces cut off from regular supply lines. Quinine for malaria prevention ran out quickly and was never adequately resupplied. Wounded soldiers often died from infections that would have been easily treatable with proper medicine and surgical supplies. Japanese documents captured later in the campaign painted a horrifying picture of conditions that defied human endurance. A medical officer's report from late October noted that more than 60% of the 17th Army's forces on Guadalcanal were incapacitated by disease or malnutrition, rather than combat wounds. Combat effectiveness had dropped to perhaps 30% of authorized strength. Units existed on paper but could not function in reality. Soldiers were dying at a rate of 50 per day, most from starvation and disease rather than American action. American supply ships, protected by Henderson Field aircraft during daylight hours, regularly delivered food, ammunition, medical supplies, and replacement equipment that maintained fighting effectiveness. Shortages occurred, particularly in August and early September, when naval defeats left Marines temporarily cut off from their supply lines. But these shortages were temporary inconveniences rather than permanent conditions. By October, the flow of supplies had become reliable and adequate. Marines ate canned rations that, while not appetizing by peacetime standards, provided adequate calories and nutrition to maintain health and combat effectiveness in jungle conditions. The contrast could not have been more stark or more decisive in determining the campaign's ultimate outcome. American forces enjoyed supply lines that seemed endless. Machine gun crews could fire continuously until their weapon barrels overheated beyond use. Then, they simply requested new barrels. The replacements arrived within hours. Medical support included complete field hospitals. Surgeons operated in canvas tents. Plasma flowed into wounded veins. Sulfur drugs fought deadly infections. Serious cases were evacuated to rear hospitals with proper operating rooms. Japanese logistics told a different story entirely. Whatever could fit on destroyer decks was all they got. Supplies that slipped through American patrol lines were treasures. Everything else was imagination. Hunger became a constant companion. A single rice ball stretched across an entire day. Soldiers chewed each grain slowly. They made it last from dawn until darkness fell. Ammunition conservation reached desperate levels. Orders restricted firing to absolute emergencies only. Every bullet had to count. Missing meant wasting what couldn't be replaced. Medical care was primitive beyond description. A dirty bandage was luxury. Amputation without pain relief was common. Infected wounds meant certain death. No drugs existed to fight disease. Seriously wounded soldiers received final gifts, hand grenades pressed into trembling palms, left behind when units moved forward, expected to end their own suffering. Better than burdening healthy men or facing capture alive. Late October brought Japan's largest offensive of the entire campaign. General Hyakutake himself arrived on Guadalcanal. His presence meant maximum importance. This attack had to succeed. Fresh troops came with him, elements of the experienced 2nd Division, veterans from brutal fighting in China. These men knew jungle warfare. They understood night attacks and close combat. The plan looked impressive on paper. Coordinated strikes from multiple directions. The main effort would punch through dense jungle. Similar terrain to Bloody Ridge, but different tactics this time. More men than previous attacks. Better coordination between units. Artillery support finally delivered by destroyer runs. Everything Japan could manage was committed to this offensive. October 23rd marked the beginning. A preliminary attack struck from the western approaches. 9 Japanese tanks led the assault. Tanks were rare on Guadalcanal because shipping them was nearly impossible. The armor rolled across the Matanica River. Tracks churned through mud and vegetation. Engines roared in the tropical heat. This was Japan's mechanized punch. American defenders waited in prepared positions. The newly arrived 164th Infantry Regiment from the American Division had joined the fight. Fresh troops with full equipment loads. Anti-tank guns opened fire first. Shells crashed into steel hulls. Artillery joined the destruction. Even an M3 Stuart tank added its firepower. 9 Japanese tanks became 9 burning wrecks within minutes. The western attack collapsed completely. Heavy casualties littered the jungle floor. Bodies lay twisted among destroyed vehicles. The preliminary assault had failed before the main offensive even began. October 24th brought the real test. Night fell across the jungle like a black curtain. Approximately 5,600 Japanese troops moved through the darkness. Major General Yumio Nasu commanded this massive force. Their objective was Henderson Field, the airstrip that controlled everything. American lines south of the runway had to be broken. Once through those defenses, victory seemed possible. The 1st Battalion, 7th Marines held the critical sector. Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller commanded these Marines. Reinforcements from the 164th Infantry strengthened his lines. This night would enter Marine Corps legend, fighting that tested every man to his breaking point. Courage measured in seconds of survival. Death walking through the jungle darkness. Japanese attacks came in continuous waves. One assault followed another without pause. Individual breakthroughs penetrated American lines. Immediate counterattacks sealed every gap. Machine gunners fired until weapons failed completely. Barrels warped from sustained heat. Mechanisms jammed from constant use. Then they grabbed rifles and kept fighting. Artillery from the 11th Marines fired danger-close missions. Shells landed within yards of Marine positions. Explosions showered friendly troops with dirt and debris. The margin between support and disaster measured in meters. Offshore, the battleship USS Washington stood ready. 16-inch guns could reach any target on the island. Naval gunfire support waited for radio calls. Massive shells could shatter any Japanese concentration. At one critical moment, only a single Marine battalion stood between Japanese forces and Henderson Field. The airstrip lay just beyond their positions. One more breakthrough might decide everything, but the line held firm. Marines absorbed attack after attack. Bodies piled in front of their positions. Machine gun fire swept away advancing waves. Artillery shattered formations before they reached American lines. Sergeant John Basilone became legend that night. He had distinguished himself at Bloody Ridge weeks earlier. Now he faced an even greater test of leadership and courage. Ammunition ran dangerously low for his machine gun section. Enemy fire swept the approaches. Movement meant almost certain death. But silence meant Japanese breakthrough. Basilone personally carried ammunition through enemy fire. Bullets cracked past his head. Explosions threw dirt into his face. He kept his guns operational through individual heroism. Damaged machine guns required immediate repair. Under direct fire, he worked on jammed mechanisms. His hands moved quickly in the darkness. Weapons returned to action within minutes. When one gun position was overrun, Basilone grabbed a .45 pistol. He led a desperate counterattack through the jungle. The line was restored through personal combat leadership. Dawn on October 25th revealed complete Japanese failure. General Nasu lay dead among his troops. Machine gun fire had cut him down during one of the night attacks. Leadership died with tactical failure. More than 2,000 Japanese soldiers had died in the failed offensive. Bodies covered the jungle floor. The breakthrough never came. Henderson Field remained in American hands. American casualties were severe, but manageable. Several hundred killed and wounded. Serious losses for individual units. But replacements were already arriving. The system continued functioning. October 1942 also brought decisive naval battles. The waters around Guadalcanal became a graveyard for ships from both sides. Naval superiority would determine the campaign's outcome. The naval Battle of Guadalcanal raged from November 12th through 15th. 4 days of surface combat that reached legendary intensity. Ships fought at point-blank range in confused nighttime melees. November 13th brought chaotic action in the darkness. American cruisers and destroyers engaged a Japanese bombardment force. 2 enemy battleships led the attack. Hiei and Kirishima brought massive firepower. Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan commanded American forces. Rear Admiral Norman Scott served as his second in command. Both would die in the fighting. They became the only American flag officers killed in surface engagements during the entire war. American losses were staggering. 2 light cruisers sank in the darkness. 4 destroyers disappeared beneath the waves. 3 more destroyers suffered severe damage. The task force was nearly destroyed, but the mission failed for Japan as well. The battleship Hiei was disabled in the night action. Aircraft found her the following morning. Bombs and torpedoes sent the giant warship to the bottom. The bombardment of Henderson Field never happened. November 14th to 15th brought the final naval confrontation. The battleship Kirishima attempted another bombardment mission. USS Washington and USS South Dakota intercepted the Japanese force. American radar-directed gunnery proved devastating. The range was so extreme that Japanese lookouts could barely see their targets. Washington's 16-inch shells crashed into Kirishima with precision accuracy. 9 shells found their mark. The Japanese battleship absorbed terrible punishment. Fires erupted throughout the superstructure. The ship began listing heavily. Kirishima sank with enormous loss of life. Perhaps most significantly, American forces destroyed a major Japanese convoy. The 38th Division was being transported with heavy equipment. 11 transport ships carried thousands of troops and supplies. Only 4 transports reached Guadalcanal. Aircraft and surface ships sank the others. Even those 4 were destroyed by artillery and air attacks before they could fully unload. Japanese casualties exceeded 5,000 men. This marked the last serious attempt to reinforce Guadalcanal with a large, properly equipped ground force. The naval battles had decided the campaign's outcome. Japanese forces on the island were now completely isolated. November brought the beginning of the end for Japanese troops already ashore. They had expected massive reinforcement and resupply. Fresh divisions would join the fight. Adequate supplies would finally arrive. Instead, they learned of complete naval defeat. The convoys were destroyed. No more help was coming. The isolation was total and permanent. Rations were reduced again. Already starving men received even smaller portions. A half-rice ball became a full day's food. Hunger gnawed at every waking moment. Medical supplies that had been critically short became completely non-existent. The wounded filled makeshift field hospitals. Doctors could do nothing except watch men die. Surgery without instruments was impossible. Captured Japanese diaries from this period revealed slow collapse. Daily entries described deteriorating conditions. Rice rations reduced to single balls per day. Disease spreading through every unit. Bodies were burned when soldiers had strength for such tasks. The realization that no more supplies would ever come. Men eating grass and bark to survive. Deaths from poisonous plants were common. The deterioration of proud soldiers into desperate, starving shadows of their former selves. Discipline cracked under the pressure of survival. Unit cohesion dissolved in hunger and desperation. December brought final reckoning from Japanese high command. Orders came from Rabaul headquarters. The decision to evacuate Guadalcanal had been made. They could not admit public defeat. But privately, leaders recognized harsh reality. Continuing the operation meant complete destruction of the 17th Army. The remaining forces had to be saved for future campaigns. Approximately 11,000 Japanese soldiers remained alive on the island. This was down from peak strength of 36,000 men. The losses were staggering by any military standard. Of those 11,000 survivors, perhaps 7,000 could actually walk. The rest were too sick to move, too wounded to travel, too weakened by starvation to crawl more than short distances. The evacuation received the designation Operation K. It would become one of the most successful Japanese operations of the entire war. A remarkable achievement under impossible circumstances. Destroyer runs similar to the Tokyo Express extracted the survivors. 3 nights in early February 1943 saw continuous evacuation efforts. Japanese naval forces displayed exceptional skill and courage. 10,652 men were successfully evacuated from Guadalcanal. This represented most of the surviving garrison. The operation succeeded despite American air and naval superiority, but it could not disguise the magnitude of defeat. Japanese forces on Guadalcanal had reached peak strength of approximately 36,000 personnel. Of these, roughly 25,000 to 30,000 died during the campaign. About 4,800 were killed in direct combat. Another 10,000 to 15,000 died from disease and starvation. American casualties were also severe but remained sustainable. Marine and Army units that fought on Guadalcanal lost approximately 1,600 killed in action. Another 4,200 were wounded in combat. Several thousand more were temporarily disabled by tropical diseases. But American industry and manpower could replace these losses easily. New divisions were already completing training programs. Ships and aircraft rolled off production lines faster than combat could destroy them. The strategic initiative had shifted permanently to American hands. No amount of Japanese courage could change this fundamental reality. The psychological impact of Guadalcanal on Japanese military thinking was devastating. For the first time in the war, Japanese forces had been decisively defeated in sustained ground combat. Every major offensive had failed completely. Every attempt to apply traditional Japanese tactical doctrine had resulted in catastrophic casualties. Pre-war assumptions lay shattered in the jungle. The revelation that American forces possessed not only material superiority but also tactical competence was shattering. Well-led troops capable of enduring terrible conditions had defeated Japan's best soldiers. Japanese officers who survived Guadalcanal and later wrote memoirs emphasized consistent themes. They had completely underestimated American fighting qualities. Individual American soldiers were formidable opponents. The disparity in equipment and supplies was far greater than intelligence had suggested. Pre-war estimates were completely wrong. American industrial capacity was overwhelming. Japanese logistics were fundamentally inadequate for sustained operations. Fighting an enemy that controlled sea and air was impossible. Supply lines couldn't function under constant attack. Spiritual power and tactical skill were insufficient against systematic disadvantages. Firepower and resources decided battles. Individual courage couldn't overcome material inferiority. Post-war accounts from Japanese veterans revealed consistent assessments. They had believed they were superior warriors in every respect. Training was harder. Acceptance of death was greater. Night fighting and close combat were specialties. But on Guadalcanal, they learned that modern war is decided by systems. The Americans had systems for everything imaginable. Systems for supply, medical care, artillery support, air coordination. Every American system functioned properly under combat stress. Japanese systems failed because they were never built properly in the first place. The foundation was flawed from the beginning. Japanese veterans who survived the campaign provided detailed accounts that contradicted official explanations. They acknowledged that American forces fought superbly at night when defending prepared positions. Americans endured malaria, dysentery, and terrible conditions while maintaining combat effectiveness. This was possible because logistics systems supported them continuously. Medical care kept men fighting. American firepower was overwhelming, coordinated, and precisely delivered. A single American battalion had more effective firepower than an entire Japanese regiment. The disparity was shocking. Technical aspects of American superiority were significant throughout the campaign. Japanese forces fought with Arisaka rifles. These bolt-action weapons required manual cycling between individual shots. American Marines initially carried M1903 Springfield rifles. Also, bolt-action weapons with similar limitations, but the M1 Garand semi-automatic rifle was becoming available in increasing numbers. The Garand's 8-round capacity and semi-automatic operation provided decisive advantages in firefights. Sustained fire without manual cycling changed tactical dynamics completely. Machine guns told an even more dramatic story. The American M19-117A1 Browning was water-cooled and could sustain fire indefinitely. As long as water and ammunition were available, it never stopped. Japanese machine guns, primarily the Type 96 and Type 99, were lighter and more portable through jungle terrain. But they lacked sustained fire capability under combat stress. In defensive positions, this difference was absolutely decisive. American machine guns could fire continuously for hours. Japanese weapons overheated and jammed within minutes. Artillery superiority was perhaps most significant of all combat factors. The 11th Marines operated M1A1 pack howitzers that could be broken down for transport. These 75mm weapons moved through jungle terrain. Responsive, accurate fire support was available within minutes of request. Forward observers with infantry units called for fire missions. Rounds landed on target consistently. Japanese artillery on Guadalcanal was limited in number. Difficult to move through dense jungle. Chronically short of ammunition for sustained bombardments. Naval gunfire added another dimension that Japanese forces could never match. Destroyers and cruisers offshore could deliver bombardments on any target. Responsive fire support for Marine ground units was available on radio request. Radio communication between shore-based observers and naval ships allowed precise targeting. Coordinates were transmitted accurately. Shells landed where needed most. Air power became increasingly dominant as the campaign progressed. The Cactus Air Force, operating from Henderson Field, established air superiority over Guadalcanal gradually. Marine and Army Air Force pilots flew F-4F Wildcats, P-39 Airacobras, and P-40 Warhawks. They intercepted Japanese bomber raids. Enemy aircraft were shot down consistently. SBD Dauntless dive bombers struck Japanese positions with precision. Supply ships became priority targets. Troop concentrations were bombed and strafed. Japanese air forces from Rabaul had to fly at extreme limits of their operational range. This gave them minimal time over target areas. Fuel constraints limited combat effectiveness. The final American ground offensive in January 1943 demonstrated how completely the balance had shifted. Major General Alexander Patch's 14th Fourth Corps launched coordinated attacks. Both Marine and Army divisions participated. Overwhelming support came from artillery, air power, and naval gunfire. Japanese positions were systematically reduced through superior firepower. Japanese resistance remained determined despite hopeless circumstances. But starvation, disease, and ammunition shortages hampered every defensive effort. The outcome was inevitable. On February 9, 1943, American patrols discovered that Japanese forces had completed evacuation. General Patch sent his famous message to Admiral Halsey. Tokyo Express no longer has terminus on Guadalcanal. The campaign was finally over. 6 months of fighting had resulted in the first major American ground victory against Japan in the Pacific War. More importantly, it established patterns and revealed fundamental truths. These lessons would shape every subsequent campaign until Japan's final surrender. Japanese survivors took devastating lessons from Guadalcanal. Pre-war military doctrine lay in ruins. The myth of Japanese warrior superiority had been completely shattered. Individual courage and tactical skill proved inadequate against systematic disadvantages. Night attacks and close combat, the hallmarks of Japanese success in China, failed against American defensive positions. Supply and logistics were not secondary concerns, but fundamental requirements for sustained combat operations. Without adequate supplies, the best soldiers in the world would starve. Air and naval superiority determined outcomes on land. Control of sea and air meant control of logistics. Control of logistics meant victory in extended campaigns. These lessons, learned in blood and starvation on Guadalcanal, should have fundamentally reformed Japanese military thinking. Some officers recognized the catastrophic implications. Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, a staff officer who visited Guadalcanal during the campaign, wrote afterward that Japan needed complete strategic reassessment. The Americans were fighting an industrial war. Material production determined outcomes in industrial warfare. Japan could not win an industrial war against American productive capacity. The disparity was too great to overcome. But Japanese military culture, built on generations of tradition and recent victories, could not easily accept such fundamental revision. Pride prevented honest assessment. Official explanations for Guadalcanal blamed inadequate supplies, naval defeats, and unexpected American defensive strength. They did not acknowledge that Japanese tactical doctrine itself was flawed. The entire conception of warfare that had served Japan well against China was obsolete against a modern industrial opponent. Everything had to change, or defeat was certain. Those Japanese soldiers who survived Guadalcanal and were later captured provided witness testimony. Others survived the entire war and spoke afterward. They became witnesses to transformation. They had entered the campaign as confident warriors of an invincible empire. Recent victories in Southeast Asia supported this confidence. Japanese forces seemed unstoppable. They left as starving, disease-ridden survivors of catastrophic defeat. Many later described Guadalcanal as the moment they first understood Japan would lose the war. Post-war testimonies from Japanese veterans captured this psychological transformation completely. They acknowledged learning truths that military leaders had hidden from them. The Americans were not weak, but overwhelmingly strong. Not just in weapons and equipment, but in organization, logistics, leadership, and the ability to sustain combat operations indefinitely. Japanese forces had fought with extraordinary courage and considerable skill throughout the campaign. Individual heroism was common. Tactical competence was high. It did not matter at all. American forces fought with systems and resources that Japanese forces could never match. Industrial capacity trumped individual courage every time. The American perspective on Guadalcanal emphasized different but equally important lessons. For Marines and soldiers who fought there, the campaign proved American forces could match Japanese troops. The mythology of Japanese invincibility was completely destroyed. American defensive doctrine worked under the worst possible conditions. Combined arms coordination was effective in jungle warfare. Individual American soldiers, properly trained and equipped, were more than capable of defeating Japanese forces in direct combat. Morale soared throughout American military units. But Americans also learned deep respect for Japanese soldiers as tough, determined, skillful adversaries. They would fight to death rather than surrender under any circumstances. The willingness of Japanese forces to continue attacking in face of hopeless odds was remarkable. Enduring starvation rather than giving up showed incredible determination. Dying rather than retreating required exceptional courage. The contrast between both sides' approaches to prisoner welfare and surrender illustrated fundamental cultural differences. American forces made significant efforts to encourage Japanese surrender. Leaflets were dropped behind enemy lines. Radio messages broadcast surrender appeals. Medical care and food were offered to prisoners. These efforts achieved minimal success. Of approximately 36,000 Japanese troops who served on Guadalcanal during the campaign, fewer than 1,000 were captured alive. Most of those were too sick or wounded to resist capture. Strategic implications of Guadalcanal extended far beyond the island itself. Japan's failure to retake Henderson Field demonstrated that the defensive perimeter could be penetrated. Allied strategies shifted from defensive operations to offensive campaigns. The industrial and material advantages America possessed could be translated into military victory through systematic application. For Japan, Guadalcanal marked the beginning of the end. Loss of experienced troops, pilots, and ships could not be replaced at anything approaching American production rates. The decision to evacuate admitted, however quietly, that Japan could not sustain attrition warfare against American industrial might. Every future battle would face the same fundamental problem. Veterans of Guadalcanal on both sides carried their experiences for the rest of their lives. American Marines and soldiers who survived became cadre for new units. Hard-won lessons about jungle warfare, defensive tactics, and combined arms coordination were passed to fresh troops. Knowledge gained through combat experience was preserved and transmitted. The 1st Marine Division, pulled off Guadalcanal in December 1942, required months of rest and rehabilitation before returning to combat. Tropical diseases and combat stress affected everyone. Japanese survivors faced an even grimmer future than their American counterparts. Those evacuated during Operation K were dispersed to other units throughout the Pacific Theater. They carried psychological burdens of defeat and knowledge that American forces were far more formidable than pre-war propaganda had suggested. Many would die in subsequent battles. Japan's strategic position continued deteriorating throughout 1943 and beyond. Each campaign brought heavier losses that couldn't be replaced. Industrial capacity was insufficient. The island of Guadalcanal itself bore combat scars for decades afterward. Wrecked aircraft, destroyed vehicles, abandoned equipment, and unexploded ordnance littered jungles and coastal areas. Henderson Field was expanded and improved during and after the campaign. It served as a major Allied base for subsequent operations throughout the Solomon Islands chain. For military historians and strategists, Guadalcanal provided comprehensive case studies. Amphibious operations, jungle warfare, logistics, air-ground coordination, and integration of naval power with land operations. The campaign demonstrated that modern warfare required more than brave soldiers and tactical skill. Industrial capacity, effective logistics, technological superiority, and ability to sustain operations were essential. The human cost of Guadalcanal was staggering on both sides throughout 6 months of combat. More than 7,000 American and Japanese servicemen died in naval battles around the island. On land, American casualties exceeded 7,000 killed, wounded, or missing. Japanese losses exceeded 30,000 from all causes. Thousands more suffered diseases affecting their health permanently. But the strategic significance justified in military terms this terrible cost. Guadalcanal represented the turning point where Allied forces shifted from defense to offense. It demonstrated that Japan could be defeated in sustained ground combat. Air and naval superiority patterns were established for the rest of the war. The story of Japanese troops encountering American jungle warfare on Guadalcanal is ultimately about collision between fundamentally different approaches to modern warfare. One side believed in supremacy of warrior spirit. Spiritual strength could overcome material disadvantages. Tactics would produce victory regardless of resource limitations. The other side believed in systematic application of industrial power. Logistics and firepower served as force multipliers. combined arms coordination was key to success. The jungle of Guadalcanal became the crucible where these conflicting philosophies met in direct combat. The outcome, though it required 6 months of brutal fighting, demonstrated fundamental truths. Concentrated fire support and logistics, combined with competent tactics and determined soldiers, created military power that Japanese forces simply could not match under any circumstances. For Japanese soldiers who survived Guadalcanal and lived to tell their stories, the campaign represented the moment when reality destroyed cherished illusions completely. They learned that their training had been based on false assumptions about enemy capabilities. Their tactics had been designed for a different kind of war entirely. Their logistics had been inadequate from the very beginning. Their nation was engaged in a conflict it could not win through military means alone. The Americans who fought on Guadalcanal learned different but equally important lessons about themselves and their enemies. They discovered they could match Japanese soldiers in combat brutality. They proved that American industrial power could be translated into military victory through proper application. Tactics and doctrine for jungle warfare were developed for subsequent campaigns. The myth of Japanese invincibility was shattered completely. It was replaced with realistic assessment of a tough, determined, but ultimately defeatable enemy. Guadalcanal was where Japanese troops were terrified not by American soldiers as individual fighters, though they proved formidable opponents in every encounter. They were terrified by systematic, overwhelming, relentless application of firepower and material resources that American forces brought to every single engagement throughout the campaign. It was terror born not from fear of death, which Japanese soldiers had been trained to accept as inevitable and honorable outcome. It was terror from realizing that courage and sacrifice were meaningless against an enemy whose supplies never ran out completely. An enemy whose wounded received proper medical care, whose artillery never stopped firing, whose aircraft controlled the skies above, whose industrial base could replace losses faster than combat could inflict them. The transformation that began when Japanese forces first encountered American jungle warfare on Guadalcanal marked a fundamental shift in the entire Pacific War. From that point forward, Japanese forces would remain on the defensive, fighting a losing battle against an enemy whose material advantages grew larger with each passing month. The jungle warfare of Guadalcanal became the template for all future campaigns. It proved that American forces could fight and win in the most difficult terrain against determined enemies. This was possible, provided they maintained adequate logistics, effective coordination, and overwhelming firepower superiority. These lessons shaped American strategy until final victory.